differences. I mean, I'm really, really pleased to see you all. It's very gratifying for me to know that the work I did on third space actually resonates, because when I first did it, it didn't resonate at all, let me tell you. And some people were, you know, really anti the whole idea. So over the years, people sort of gathered pace. So it's just really nice to see a room full of people who are interested. And in a way, I kind of feel that practice is now catching up with the kind of theory I developed. Although I discovered after I'd done it that third space wasn't actually my idea at all, but I applied it to higher education, which was the originality. So that was an interesting sort of element, because I was new to research at the time, and I sort of thought everything had to be absolutely original. But as you all know, of course, you know, there are many types of originality. I usually say a bit about my own background, because after I left Warwick, I eventually got into what was then called university administration, the sort of Mike Shattuck mould. And latterly I also did some policy work at the University of London before it imploded. And then I was sent down on a secondment to a medical school and worked in medical schools for 13 years. So I mean, it was all quite serendipitous in a way, my career. And I had an arts degree and an English and European literature degree from Warwick. And I didn't have any idea of what I wanted to do, apart from the fact that I did not want to be a school teacher. And my father in particular and my school, you know, so that's where you were heading if you were a woman in the 60s and you'd been to university, especially if you'd done an art subject. So my whole career was really an attempt not to be a school teacher. I have huge admiration for school teachers, let me say, but I just knew that I wouldn't be any good at it. So I was very pleased to find a different career. But when I was at King's College London and managing the medical school there, and there was a merger of three institutions, Guy's, King's and St Thomas's. And it sort of became very clear that there were three medical school secretaries, and you know, there was only going to be one needed. And I was very fortunate, because I'd already started doing a PhD, because I'd been very involved with writing. I edited the Association of University Administrators journal for 10 years, and I've been involved with training and staff development and so on. And I'd started a PhD in my early 50s, I might add, just to encourage any of you who are thinking of starting a bit later in life. And I was getting towards the end of it, and again, serendipitously, I was asked by Robin Middlehurst, who was Director of Research at the Leadership Foundation at the time, if I'd apply for one of their research grants, which they were in the mid-2000s were setting up. She said, there's nobody else that can do this. I want you to look at professional staff. And this was sort of quite new, because nobody thought that professional staff were worth studying. Everybody was looking at academic identities. So I was able to move on from my doctorate, which I got in 2008. And then sort of this merged into the Leadership Foundation project, which is really how I got into third space, because it suddenly sort of dawned on a train that third space is what I was talking about. I was looking out the window at fields, I might add. I never quite understood where it came from, but it popped into my head. Okay, I just want to, in a way, fast forward a bit, because since then, after I'd done this report and on finishing my doctorate, I was then offered, again, it was a bit serendipitous, a part-time role at the Institute of Education, as it was then, which is now part of University College London, because Mike Shattuck and some other people were setting up an MBA, and it was thought that my experience on the professional side would be useful. So that's how I started another career at the age of, I don't know what I was, 57 or 8 or something, completely new career, become an academic. So what I've been doing more recently is looking at academic careers, but in a way, the way they kind of, is the word segue into professional careers and vice versa. And this has really become much more mainstream now. And a lot of my recent works, particularly the ESLC grant we've got at the Centre for Global Higher Education at UCL, is all to do with the diversification of the workforce. And particularly the way that academic careers and other careers, like the civil service, are sort of breaking down. They're no longer necessarily age-wage connected, if you see what I mean. Linear careers with career ladders, although they still exist, and universities are at pains to develop their linear career ladders on the teaching side, you know, on the enterprise side, etc., knowledge exchange side. What we're finding in our research is that individuals are taking matters into their own hands much more and developing their own kind of portfolio careers within the framework when it suits them, but also outside the framework, for instance in the community and in industry and with other kinds of sectors. And what's also happening is there's much more mobility. People are coming into universities, particularly from practitioner backgrounds, health, social care, and you know yourselves at Warwick. You've got a medical school now, etc., etc. But when I was at Birmingham, it was Birmingham Medical School for 5 years, we brought in the nurses and the physios. So I was quite involved in that at the time. Also, I've met a lot of people who work in the media journalism, for instance. So they employ a lot of journalists who come in and out, perhaps have a part-time lectureship or work in universities for a while, then move back into journalism and business, of course. So much more sort of permeability between higher education and other sectors. There's been a huge amount in the Times Higher and the press about different types of contracts, and a lot of it quite contentious and political. The fact that junior researchers are very insecure these days. I mean, they always have been, but I've got a research assistant who's nearly 40, and I guess that shows that it's, you know, not that temporary these days. But at the Institute, we have people who are tied to specific income streams. For instance, if the MBA imploded, which it nearly did, it's carrying on actually, but you know, then part of my work wouldn't exist, and they might reduce me from 2.5 days a week to 1.5 days a week. I mean, it doesn't matter to me because I'm well past retirement age, but there are younger people on those sorts of contracts, which again can make people feel quite insecure in the mid-career. But what I also found in a project I did with George Gordon, also funded by the Leadership Foundation, was that some of this movement was sort of coming bottom up, and people, because of dual careers, wanting more flexible lifestyles, elder care, some people ran their own business and also had a university appointment. There's a sort of bottom-up groundswell of people wanting more flexibility, as well as universities wanting to create more flexibility for themselves. And the example that's always given is annualised hours. But there is kind of movement both ways, I think. So, I mean, all I would say, it's not all bad. There is not, you know, there are cases for people wanting to be more flexible and mobile. And of course, there are new sort of areas that people have job titles in employability, e-learning, all these areas that you'll be very familiar with, which just didn't exist even 20, 25 years ago. So that's the kind of context and background. And so what I was saying about this third space doesn't seem so extraordinary anymore, because it's all against this background, and people like yourselves are much more mobile. So I've mentioned the very first project I did for the Leadership Foundation, and this was actually an international project. I went to the US and Australia. I was very lucky to have contacts there. And what I found during that particular project was that just more than half the respondents were people what I saw as sort of, I originally called them project professionals, because they were people who are very project oriented, whatever their job title. They often had doctorates. They might well not have been on academic contracts. They often undertook research into their own institution or into their own work. They were publishing, quite often publishing, as I was, in the Journal of University Administrators. And in many ways, they were sort of quasi-academics. And this suddenly sort of leapt out at me when I was looking at those of you who've done research. You know, I was reading these qualitative transcripts, and you know how you're kind of looking for things. I sort of was trying to find things that I hadn't been looking for, and this is what I found. You know, trying to find a lens and look at the gaps and what wasn't being said and all this kind of thing. And the words that kept coming out were boundaries, in-between roles, etc., you'll all be so familiar with now, which didn't really fit the specifications that people have in their job descriptions, for instance. And I looked at people's job descriptions and then looked at what they'd said, and I thought, well, there's a huge mismatch here, which is what was interesting. And subsequently, William Locke and I did a project for the Higher Education Academy, which is now Advanced HE, and we've now got the ESRC project on the implications of a diversifying workforce for academic identities and careers. William's gone to a chair in Melbourne, I might add. So I'm now leading the project, which was a responsibility I wasn't really looking for at this stage. But anyway, there you are. I mean, who would think I'd still have a job now? Okay, so what I found was people of what I call mixed, hybrid roles, whatever you like, before I came up with Third Space, was that people were quite upfront about the fact that they had a research training, master's degree, and often a doctorate, particularly in the States, people had doctorates. And they accepted that they might get a role that wasn't purely academic. Often they'd worked in adult or further education, particularly people in this country, policy agencies, charitable sectors, third sectors, NGOs, those kinds of areas. But what sort of epitomised it for me was, it was not this university, it was another new university. I interviewed somebody who's called the Learning Partnership Manager, who Gwen reminds me of, very, very outgoing, very competent, very good at her job. It was a woman, incidentally, and I have a theory that more women are good at being third space but I have never proved that because I've never had the funding to do a project on that. But maybe it's something to do with multitasking, families, children, etc. But I'm sure the men in the room may disagree. Anyway, this job description said they wanted somebody with academic credibility, experience of generating external income, and involvement in project management, which I thought, well, that is quite innovative. Never seen that in a job description before, and it brought together academic work. This, again, it's about 10 years ago, so it was quite new then. To be academic, also be generating external income, and also being involved in project management. So I thought that was very interesting. And it was another, what I call a new university, i.e. 1960s university, with quite a very innovative registrar, actually. And so it often depends on the individual leadership. People say, well, what were these roles? I mean, I won't go through them all in detail. I mean, I focused on the teaching and learning ones for the purposes of this group, but obviously there are quite a lot on the research enterprise side as well. You'll be familiar with all these things. I'm sure you're all involved. Online learning, of course, has burgeoned and developed in the last 10 years, much more than could have been imagined. Much more in community partnership, employability, all those kinds of areas have come on stream. Knowledge exchange, what they call in America institutional research. We call it policy and planning, but it's really looking at what you're doing, looking at the way the university does things, how this can be developed and improved. So all these kinds of roles have become solidified, if you like. I mean, perhaps in the past they were done, but they were kind of not talked about or a bit invisible. So when I went back and talked to the 42 people I'd identified, I went back and talked to, I then asked if I could go back into the institutions and talk to more people who I thought were in mixed roles. And I was particularly interested why people, particularly those people with doctorates, had actually ended up doing these kinds of things. And quite I was surprised because I thought, well, perhaps they're sort of failed academics, but they weren't. Oh, well, some of them may have been, but they all put some positive spin on it. And, there's quite a lot of kind of commitment to things like widening participation, equity and diversity, community engagement, public engagement is another one that's come on since then. There were people in mid-career who their research was going nowhere. Basically, they hadn't got any more funding, so I suppose in that sense they were failed academics. But they got, and I had examples of this in the medical school. There are people in medical sciences who weren't doing any research, but at the time there was a huge push to get more people who wouldn't normally be qualified into medical schools. I'm sure you're doing that now at Warwick. but that we were quite ahead of the game at King's at the time. But this provided a sort of end of career path, if you like, for a number of people who were very committed sort of ideologically to this, and who almost found a new career for themselves, quite late on. So that was quite interesting. Some people actually said they found being an academic quite lonely, particularly, I suppose, if they weren't in a research team, weren't being funded. And they preferred working on projects with other people, mixed teams, found that more stimulating. And of course, some people had practical reasons. They wanted a job in a particular city or town. They liked working on a university campus, who doesn't? They were given a funding opportunity, to work in a particular unit. So there were all these reasons, some ideological, some more practical. And this is just another example from this lady who's, don't know if she's still there, Learning Partnerships Manager. And she was very positive about her role and said, I've always worked at interfaces, although I occasionally say, well, of course, we're just being marginalised. I like to be where it doesn't matter if you bend the rules or do things differently. And this is sort of quite important identity marker, I felt, because some people found third space, the whole idea of it, very threatening. So I felt it was sort of a certain sort of person that liked to be there, was quite proactive in making the most of being in that position. But obviously, when I looked at people's sort of employment categories and job descriptions, it didn't reflect the reality that they might be, crossing over boundaries. They were either categorised academic or non-academic. I mean, I never use the term non-academic. I have to wash my mouth out if I use it, because it's very kind of non-flattering to people on academic contracts. But that's how the universities, they have, I was always on non-academic contracts, and I think they call them professional contracts now, which is slightly better. So, as I said, boundaries are much more permeable. And I thought these two words, third space, you only have to think of two words, to get invited and have a job, for the rest of your life. A friend of a friend invented the BRIC acronym. Somebody who worked for Goldman Sachs, Russia, India, China, what's the big? Brazil. And, he's now in the House of Lords, but unfortunately it doesn't happen for me, no. I'm still an associate professor. Anyway, but I then, of course, went to the books. Didn't really have so much internet those days, and I found that it was a concept, not being a cultural studies person. I didn't know that. But anyway, it is I'll talk about it in a minute. It is a sort of well-known concept in cultural studies, but I applied it, as I said, to higher education. And I always say, kind of, you can't reify the concept too much. I mean, some people say to me, am I in third space or not? But it is just a concept. And to me, it represents the way people approach their roles as well as the role itself. So I think that's quite important when you're thinking about it. To with perception. This is the original diagram, or one of the original diagrams I came up with, and I published a book in 2013, it's in there. And again, I won't go through every detail, but my supervisor, Professor Ron Barnett, who's long since retired, always used to say, you've got to get your PhD on one page of A4 in a diagram. He's very keen on diagrams. And this was, actually this wasn't my PhD, but this was the next project after that. But I thought, well, I've got to get this on one page. And in fact, it sort of flowed off the pen quite easily, because all the time I'd been in university admin, you've still got professional staff on one side and academic staff on the other. I'm not saying that doesn't exist anymore. But you always had people who were sort of interested in pastoral support, who went into schools and gave talks. And you always got sort of professional staff who were doing stuff with particularly study skills and regional development, all those sorts of things. But in the centre, I mean, different universities package these activities in different ways. So don't take this as gospel in your university, and you can draw your own diagrams, I'm sure, of Warwick and your own units. But it seemed to me there were bundles of activity that were clustered together. One around the student experience, learning support's another. I mean, I've chosen these because you're sort of learning and teaching sort of people, and then community and business partnerships, sort of encompassing research, knowledge exchange, all those things. But as I said, you know, you can mix and match those individual, the individual headings under the main headings, and there'll be different ways of describing these activities. But what it seemed to me was happening at the time was you've got these mixed teams of people working together. Actually, quality assurance was the first, I would say, was the first thing that happened in third space, really, because you've got mixed teams of people that were professional staff who'd did this over and over again, and were very familiar with the quality assurance agencies, or what they were called then, and, you know, almost as familiar with them as they were with university staff. And so the university staff were very keen to learn from them. And so that was a good example where it worked. But some people were actually saying to me, I see myself as a higher education professional, and my next job move, or I'm selling myself to headhunters, will be a Pro-Vice Chancellorship in student experience, or trying to think, or the current sort of, what are you called?
I get called all sorts.
Well, yeah. Anyway, these, student experience, I don't know, knowledge exchange, etc., etc. These were terms that, you know, were not on stream in the 90s, so these were all new terms to me. But I thought that was quite interesting. They didn't see themselves as one thing or another, and they were actually seeing themselves getting to a top job through a third space route. I mean, those of you as social scientists, sociologists, probably know this, but I thought it was really interesting, the idea that third space is more interested in spatial relationships, and particularly relationships between people, than sort of longitudinal accounts of how people got to where they are. So they're sort of more significant than structures, and by structures in universities I mean policy documents, job descriptions, you know, organisational trees, charts, you know, all that kind of stuff that we've all got in our drawers. What do they mean, you know? And also social networks, of course, in the last 10 years, I mean, increased exponentially. So, I mean, I thought it was very apposite, the whole idea, become more apposite over the years. And it's usually applied to, you know, ideas about diversity and difference, gender studies, cultural geography, class particularly. I mean, I'm not into all that, but that's where it comes from. And there's some very interesting monographs, and Edward Said, Omi Baba, people like that. But what really resonated with me was that it provided for new voices and perspectives which had been invisible, so making the invisible visible. I mean, I felt that was very much what I was doing, and the implicit explicit, and that even more so. I mean, because it was, you know, these voices are not really been, they may have been sort of heard, but they hadn't been articulated in a way that was different from being academic or professional. So anyway, I then went on. How am I doing for time? Oh, goodness. Okay. I'll just sort of go quickly through, but I had to have this theoretical map, this conceptual map, and I had 4 lenses. One was spaces, the next was knowledges, the third was relationships, and the fourth was legitimacies or authority. And I felt those were the domains in which these people were trying to develop their identities. So this is always what I'm trying to get my students to think in terms of conceptual frameworks, and they find it very difficult. So what came through the narratives was that it was both a safe and a risky space, and you had to be able to cope with that. I mean, quite often people have been appointed by a senior member of staff who wanted them to be experimental and creative, didn't mind if they made a few mistakes, but wanted them to be innovative and move things on. We obviously didn't want them to make too many mistakes, but, you know, wanted the whole thing to be developmental. And what one person's, well, again, this learning partnerships manager in a new university said, well, sometimes I'm seen as an academic unit and sometimes as an office, and that's really helpful to me because people don't see me as attached to a particular agenda, particularly academics, and she turned it to advantage. But the other side of that, the flip side of that is, there wasn't always somebody to ask about whether a course of action was right or likely to succeed. Often they had to make decisions on their own, try it and see. There was sort of lack of organisational checks and balances, by which I mean there wasn't necessarily a committee you could take an idea to. And this led to the idea that sometimes people felt they were flying under the radar, as I put it, and they were sort of happy to do that. But there was also what I call, the dark side of third space. Some people felt, they're in a state of struggle and tension some of the time, but they thrived on that. Other people don't thrive on it. So, it's a certain sort of person, I think, that was able to do this. And a number of people said, well, I work with the structures, I'm very good at doing that, but I'm able to critique them as well and try and change them. And they found being outside sort of mainstream committees often quite useful. Well, they didn't want to be too much outside the mainstream structures, but they were able to sort of operate almost, not exactly on their own, but they were able to make their own networks and their own entrees into places. Anyway, there is a bit of literature about this. Well, not really about third space, but certainly there was a literature, an idea that there's this, management is terribly contested in higher education, and all the managerialism literature says that, there are these wicked managers who are invisible, who are sort of changing things, and academics don't have a say. So, there's that literature, and Barbara Kem talks about secret managers. She was in Germany, retired now. Gary Rhodes in the States. But there's always this sort of undercurrent of, people are being manipulative, etc., etc. And the people I met were very good at countering those and making friends with academic colleagues, etc., etc. But there is this kind of political element, the sense of subversion that came out, and I'd be interested to hear from you about that. Whether you feel that's the case. Maybe it isn't anymore, because maybe third space is much more accepted. They're very good at sort of taking the part of other people, sort of understanding the other point of view, what I call contextual cross-boundary knowledge. And I was always totally amazed by this sort of faculty manager who had an accountancy background. I always found working with accountants quite difficult. Anyway, so it's not enough just to know how to be an accountant or to manage staff. In order to be effective within the university, you need to understand the context. And I thought I was incredibly enlightened from this person at the time, maybe less so now. So I've mentioned online and distance learning. In the recent project we've done, we found, we call them the invisible academics, because there are actually people employed just to run online courses, and none of the kind of workload models work for them, because, they're not sort of in a classroom so many hours, etc., etc. So there are all kinds of university mechanisms that people have to deal with that just don't fit what they're doing. But that's a very good example. People doing employability, etc., etc. I've mentioned sort of self-reflective research, for instance, into pedagogy, student outcomes, student employability. All these areas are really important now. And also, I'm sure some of you do publish, but there are often admissions, so I call it permission to publish. I did come across people who say, well, I'm allowed to publish in my own time, but I can't put the university's name on the article, etc., etc. Maybe that's not the case anymore, but it was at the time. My last monograph actually was about changing relationships in universities, and I think that is, it applies to all of you if you're in third space. I think it's a very under-researched area. And I was really impressed by this educational technologist. And again, my own prejudice, I always felt technologists were like accountants, were really difficult to deal with, not many people skills, only interested in. So, well, I was wrong, because now I met this person. If you get the relationships right, everything else falls into place. But you've got two different groups of people often talking two different languages, and it was this ability to recognise people talking different languages and to try and understand, interpret, translate, etc. that was important. Also developing new languages, of course, around all these new things that have come into universities. And they were good at doing that. So, and the other word that kept coming up time and again, I said to people, do you see yourself as a manager or a leader? Or both, or neither. And a lot of people said to me, I see myself in partnership with my academic colleagues. They preferred leadership to management, but as I say, partnership was the word that was used most. And of course, developing internal and external networks. But of course, again, since I did all this, you know, the internet is, you know, social media, etc. Networking is ubiquitous. Even for people that don't think they're very good at it. And the final one, sort of legitimacy, I mean, that came over time and again, you know, because I can't say I've got authority because of my title anymore. I mean, in the old days, I went from being an admin assistant to an assistant registrar to a senior assistant registrar to, I don't know, medical school secretary, I suppose. But none of those titles, you know, in the old days, you know, Mike Shattuck was respected because he was a registrar. I'm sure he's respected anyway, but people don't have those sorts of titles anymore. And it was very hierarchical. I mean, when I started, I was only allowed to speak to the person above me and the person below me in the hierarchy. If I wanted to speak to the person above that, I had to go through my boss, you know. I mean, and they were very, this was at Kent, by the way, we weren't, yeah, it was very conservative. And this was in the 70s and 80s. And then at one point, all the admin assistants decided they'd get together in the middle of the campus from the different faculties, just have a chat about what they were doing. And the registrar was up in arms that they should do that without him in the chair. It was a him, of course. Anyway, that's, so what people were saying to me was that, you know, they had to develop their own personal authority. There's no authority that you come with, it's what you are, not what you represent. And again, this educational technologist, I really like this quote, I've had to create my own role and find my own ways into systems and force my way into meetings rather than wait for somebody to ask me to contribute. So, I mean, again, showing sort of proactive stance that people are taking. Another person said, well, you know, I finished my PhD and came into learning and teaching unit and I was very shy. And I didn't like to speak up. And so, well, I soon got over that. And the way I did that, it's quite a young person. I met her 10 years later, actually, doing another project. Anyway, she said I sort of learned to divorce argument from people. She wasn't, you know, learned not to take what they were saying personally. And I think that can be quite difficult for, you know, when you're starting out, because you feel that everything, somebody's criticising your argument, or what you're saying, they're criticising you. So I thought it was quite telling, really. And you know, the sociological concept of taking the part of the other, people were very good at doing that, understanding responses from academic colleagues. Two things that came out was that a number of people said to me, well, academic and professional staff have totally different timescales and rhythms to their work, which is true, because professional staff, if they're running a research grant, for instance, you know, you have to keep the accounts clean. You have to, you know, report back to the funder every so often. You know, you have to finish when you're supposed to finish, etc., etc. Of course, academic work is very open-ended, so I know, you know, you've seen both sides of it. So, so that, you know, was quite interesting. And then, I mean, another person said, I know that the attitude of my academic colleagues is that if I can solve a problem for them, they'll come back and work with me again. And I thought that was very, very telling as well. You know, you have to build up the credibility. How are we doing for time? I mean, this is just an example of an employability manager in a post-1992 university, actually. But they worked in a very hard inner city environment in which the students, the aspirations of students, staff and employers were extremely low. And this lady, again, it was a lady, she was extremely enthusiastic. She'd worked in equal opportunities in local government, actually, come into the university. And she'd been very, very active in collaborating with academic staff who were very resistant to having anything about employability in the curriculum. So she went into the classroom and gave sessions, worked with local employers, brought them onto campus, got them doing mock interviews, talking to the students. And so, you know, gradually managed to raise the game for all of them, really, and was very proud of herself because she got students who got internships in the City of London. It was a London institution, And what she said was she created safe space for the students, but also for the employers and the staff in doing this. I mean, it was in the early days of employability. And she also said, I take people to places they wouldn't normally go to. And I really liked that. I thought it was really inspiring. And she was very good about succession planning with her own team of staff, because she wanted them to, she said, well, I might not be here forever, and I want them to be able to carry on the work. So anyway, just a couple of slides on, you'll have issues that you want to raise, but one of the things that came up was, people felt they didn't have a real identity, what their status was, and one person said to me, I'm a director but not a director, the extent of my authority and jurisdiction is unclear, and that came up quite a lot. We've mentioned people having academic credentials but being classified as non-academic. But in fact, one person said to me, as soon as I got my doctorate, I could see the change in the way people spoke to me. Oh yeah, I will give the example in relation to, academics always think that professional staff have all the power, and professional staff think the academics have all the power. I mean, it's, in a way, and also, if you talk to academic staff about a specific colleague that they work with, like, I don't know, faculty administrator or something, they'll speak very highly of them. But if you talk about the administration in general, I know you're not administrators, but they haven't a good word to say about it. I mean, it's a bit like political parties. I mean, I always think it's a bit different, today of all days, but generally speaking, in the old days, on the floor of the House of Commons, each party had to criticise the other party. That's what they stood up and did. But they're all great mates. They all worked in select committees together, drank in the bar, went to each other's parties. And if you went into the House of Commons as an outsider and you weren't an MP, you really were an outsider. And all the MPs were they were all sort of us, and you were them. So they come together when as a group. There's a sort of group and individual thing. And I think it's the same with academic staff and professional staff. I mentioned, people are different about managing, but these people I met were obviously very good with people, very good at relationships, often quite keen to show themselves as being in a neutral position, not taking the sides, but also very politically aware, and they managed to balance that. I've got a good few examples of that. There were issues about, I'm sure you have issues about where you go next and whether you're getting career development, promotion, but also rewards and incentives, whether you stay in the same kind of role and make a career of it, whether you aim for a chair, or some people were getting faculty roles, say, in teaching and learning, and that was quite good. They got a faculty title and perhaps a bit more money, and that gave a step to something else, or become Pro Vice Chancellor, that kind of way. So there are all kinds of issues around that. The issues for institutions, and again, I've actually had 1 or 2 Vice Chancellors contact me about this, which is quite gratifying. How to develop a relationship with so-called mainstream activity. Recognition, rewards and incentives. Are workload models appropriate? In my experience, they hardly ever are. Promotion criteria, etc. There's much more mentoring and coaching these days, I think, but certainly a lot of the people I interviewed said, well, I had the support of the registrar or Pro Vice Chancellor, and that saved me in many cases because I was doing quite experimental things, and as long as I had the backing of this person, I knew I was all right. Quite a lot of people had managed to persuade their line managers, who could have a very critical role in all this, to let them do some kind of internal consultancy or secondment. I did secondments and exchanges in my career and I got stuck. Work-based research, etc., advanced HE opportunities. But I always say it's the responsibility on the individual as well as the institution. To be honest, in my experience, it's not institutions who've helped me, it's individual. I've helped myself, and I've had, long periods, what I call fallow periods in my career, and I couldn't seem to do anything or get anywhere. But there's never been the institution really that's helped me. It's always been an individual that I happened to know me from some other work I was doing. And these are sort of questions that I've been asked in previous presentations and comments that people have made. I mean, you'll probably agree that third space is only recognised by people who are in it. But as I said, I think it's more recognised by senior managers now. The other question I'm always asked is, well, at what point does what I'm doing become not third space and mainstream? And I think that's a very good question. I don't know the answer to it. A couple of vice chancellors have said to me, I'd really like to create a third space environment. How do I go about doing that? And I don't know. However, I would say it depends on the people you appoint. I mean, you can't just create it, you have to create the right people. But other people have said to me in these kinds of environments, well, we're all third space now. Any academic is doing all these things anyway. So, it's not a separate category. We're doing, international things and regional things and student experience stuff, employer things. So I leave you with those few ideas, but I'm sure you've got questions and observations which I may or may not be able to answer. But food for thought, I hope. Okay?
Thank you very much.
It's a quick counter through, sorry.
I'm sure there are questions there.
Yep.
You want to do?
Lady in red. one of the ladies in red.
Hi, I'm sorry if you mentioned it and I missed it. I was just wondering if among your informants there were any international members of staff. Because in everything that you mentioned, I realized those people who don't have resident permits, but who are either EU or non-EU citizens, who are kind of caught up in the situation. So I was just wondering if you had any informants in that situation.
Yeah. I mean, remember this was, 10 plus years ago, so EU issues weren't, they weren't, hadn't come to the fore then. I'm trying to think. I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, certainly not more than 10%, I would say. I mean, I don't think I asked people's nationality. Well, I'm sure perhaps I did, but I can't remember if that was a key element, to be honest. So I'm afraid I'm not being very helpful about that. But I wasn't really so much interested. I mean, you see, the people in the United States and Australia, I don't think I was aware of where else they might have come from. I just thought of them as being, I mean, I suppose some of them had come from other places. But in this country, I would say perhaps 5%. I mean, I was more interested in gender, actually. The first tranche, it was definitely 50-50 gender. But when I went back to meet people who, I categorised as third space, who I'd asked registrars to put me in touch with, 2/3 were women. But I've never been able to go back. I've never had the funding to go back and check whether this would be more widespread. Yep.
I was really taken by that phrase about making the invisible visible, the implicit explicit. And I wondered if you found that one of the things that characterises the third space professionals often is working with multiple departments. Because in a very distributed and diverse organisation like this, there's a subculture within the department and certain ways of working.
Absolutely.
If you're working in whatever the sort of area is, whether it's employability or internationalisation, you're forced to abstract some of those concepts, those professional concepts, because you're working with multiple departments.
And you also have to understand their languages.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree, and that's what people in those sorts of jobs were good at doing. I mean, in the original project I did for my doctorate, really, I did come across people called bounded professionals. I had 3 categories: bounded professionals, cross-boundary professionals, and unbounded professionals. And it was really the unbounded professional category that eventually developed in third space people. But the people, I mean, again, I started my PhD in 2002, so it's a long time ago. But there were quite a lot of bounded professionals who I think if I went back, I would not find so many. I mean, they couldn't bear it if anybody from another department came and looked at what they were doing. They just absolutely couldn't bear it. I met, a lot of people like that, and that was sort of my generation. I'm not saying I was like that, but of course. But you know, where at Kent particularly, you weren't allowed to tread on anybody else's turf at all. It was terribly territorial, and the whole structure was set up to be like that. So, yeah, you have to tread carefully if you, yeah.
I wonder how much we really know about the situation with what we call these other people over there, the academics,
Yeah.
and how flexible, diverse, and fluid that whole world is, and how fast it's changing. I suspect it's actually changing much faster than we know.
It is.
And if many academics hear this description of third space, they're going to say, "Oh, that's me."
Yeah, well, they do. I mean, I don't know how many. Some of you are on academic contracts, aren't you? Some of you work in academic departments, so
Yeah.
I have to be very careful not to talk about us and them too much, because of course I'm an academic now. But I would say the work I've done in the last last three projects, which has been with academic staff, I mean, just enormous changes. And I mean, there is a case for saying we're all third space now. I think.
Positive, though. So,
Yeah.
a little while back, I interviewed and did some participant observation with
Yeah.
our National Teaching Fellowship,
Yeah.
and, Teaching Excellence winners and various people like that. So leading academics, and I found that actually they were much more diverse and flexible than I expected.
Yeah.
But a characteristic of those successful academics was that they were actually entirely happy to be visible about that and to be explicit
Sure.
about all of the complexities and the fluidity and flexibility. Whereas other academics, not so. So the more successful ones, less defensive about being pure academics.
Sure.
So,
No, well, last year I published a paper in higher education called The Itinerant Academic, and that was all about that. Yep,
I'm interested in your question about chemically created,
yep,
your background in the AUA, I think.
yeah, yeah,
University Administrators. And, I work in CLL, where we offer a master's in career education guidance and higher education. So it's kind of a niche third space professional
yeah, yeah.
master's. And we've got about 100 students on it at any one time.
Gosh,
across the
yeah.
UK. And I suppose that there's two ways in which the sort of how clinically created come in there. One is having some kind of professional development structure like a master's.
Yep,
And the other would be professional body and
Yep.
with a professional body. That would
it's a good point.
suggest new ways of sort of getting in there.
But of course, there are vested interests in, I mean, I was very involved with the AUA for about 20 years, but I haven't really been for the last 10 years. But I can imagine there are vested interests in organisations, whether they're academic or professional, about keeping, you know, their boundaries and their identity. So I agree entirely with what you're saying. I think and the master's degree is a great idea. But I agree that I think that, you know, professional bodies are quite conservative, I think. So that would be a very interesting one.
The other thing I was thinking is much more practical from a career guidance point of view, is that quite a lot of the information that's around about getting into academia is out of date.
Yeah,
And
I know.
your work shows that up quite graphically, in that we need to kind of update the information that people are getting
yeah,
about
yeah.
working in academia, because it's still quite narrow.
I mean, no, I agree entirely. I mean, we're about to, from the recent project, we're just about to publish a working paper. Actually, it's supposed to be out in February, but I think it's going to be next week. Did I send you a draft of that? No. Maybe. Oh, well, I mean, it's quite long. It's about 20,000 words. I wrote it, basically. But, you know, all these it's written really from the academic point of view, but all these ideas come out in it about how fluid it is now, and how, you know, although universities are very, very keen, so we've expanded our career routes, they're still quite sort of tram lines compared with what people are really doing. And individuals are being very creative and innovative with their lives and their, you know, their jobs as part of their lives, particularly younger staff, by which I mean sort of under 40, I suppose. But the other interesting thing that came out was how uncertain people in their 40s and 50s can be. And I certainly found that, you know, you can get to a certain point, middle grade, middle management, middle career, and, you know, perhaps you're not going to get a chair or get to the very top, you know. So what do? I was lucky I found a PhD, but, you know, even if I, you know, had stayed on for another 5 years or something, So, you know, and even now, I'm part-time past retirement age, and I'm doing it because I like it. But, you know, I was saying to Gwen, I was hoping for readership, and I was about to apply, and they abolished them. So I'll be an associate professor forever, but I'll obviously never get a chair. But, you know, if I was 20 years younger, to even 10 years younger, I'd be thinking about what can I do. So I don't want any more money, because that will create more obligation, you know. So the head of department said, well, you can apply to go beyond because I'm on a bar, you know how it is. I have got my USS pension, so I'm very lucky. But so no, I don't want more money. It'll put more pressure on me, you know. And you know, I never used to think like that, of course, when I was in a career. Yeah.
That's a really interesting one, isn't it? That title. I mean, you said earlier you'd interviewed somebody who said, you know, people start treating me differently once I got the PhD.
Yeah.
I absolutely recognise that, and that's really weird because I did my Viva 2 months after I got my chair.
Yeah.
So I became a professor before I had my doctorate. I mean, it's a long story, but anyway.
Yeah.
So I did it later in life as well. But actually, those identifiers. What people do, and you've mentioned that as well, they speak one language in one situation, a different language with other people. My line of work, that's called code switching.
Switch
codes and attitudes,
that's really interesting.
And which politics you emphasize or don't emphasize, what identities you relate to. That sort of code switching, you do that all the time.
I like that.
The minute you get that title, like, you know, a readership, it's clear that you've got a strong research record, because that's where the reader traditionally, and certainly in university you're with now, would relate to. So that means that that constant code switching becomes very, very different, and people will relate to you differently because they'll do less code switching because they know what you are. And that makes the work in a way easier. I think for me, when I came across third space professional first, I had long described, when people asked me, what is it that you do? And, you know, at that point, what you were working on, this is a funny job. Yes, it is a funny job, because I've got one hand on the administrative side, and I've got one hand on the academic side, and I just hope that nobody chops me, because coming down the other end is really going to hurt. Essentially, you lose your job. Those kind of roles is often what you're in. And it's political, and it's messy, but it's also incredibly liberating, because I can make a lot of choices about what I do, what I don't do, who I do work with, who I don't work with, what I do in terms of code switching and whatever. And that would be much narrower if I was just an academic, or
that's what people are saying.
Representative kind of role. So it's quite a messy place, but what's striking,
ambiguity, coping with ambiguity.
Some people find that hugely liberating, but it's a particular kind of people. And for some people, that is as frightening as whatnot.
Well, when I first gave this talk, I suppose about 12 years ago, I mean, there were some people who were it made them incredibly angry, and they said, you know, you're sort of disenfranchising us, sort of thing. And, I mean, one woman was almost in tears. I mean, so it's only one talk I gave in one university, but I was amazed. But then, you know, as time went on, and then when I went into Europe and did it at a conference, completely blank faces. It's about 2009, I think. But now, you know, I'm going to Switzerland next week, Germany next month. You know, they're all really keen on third space, and you know, they used to say, "We don't know what you're talking about." So, you know, I do feel, well, it's sort of rather late on. It's sort of come into its own. So, yeah.
Just wondering, have you taken this research to people from other industries where they are already much more flexible?
Well, no, I haven't. I mean,
are they just baffled by us?
I haven't got time to, you know, do the research I'm supposed to be doing. But I mean, I think the creative industries of, you know, Google and so have been doing all this, you know, for years, haven't they? And really, I mean, I don't know if there are any sort of engineers in the room, but you know, the creative engineering industries have matrix structures to go back to Handy's old organisational structures. They're sort of intersecting the whole time. So I think university is very conservative, actually, surprisingly. I mean, that's my conclusion. The structures are certainly very conservative, but they have this sort of person culture underneath, with people being very individual and very innovative, and I don't think the two, you know, really come together very naturally. that's why there are tensions and there's, you know, all the stuff you get in the Times Higher all the time. You know, they pick on some little thing and inflate. I mean, don't get me wrong. You know, I think, you know, it is insecure for younger people, and I think, you know, perhaps there ought to be more help, etc., etc. And for, you know, but I think the whole profession, you know, the whole thing has become more insecure certainly than when I started in the 70s. But everything's become more insecure, hasn't it? Every type of job. I mean, I've got a friend who was in local government, and that used to be as safe as houses. That was the other thing they wanted me to go. The career advisor at Warwick said I should go into local government, and I thought, but anyway, I'm told that it's even more insecure than universities now. So
I'm very aware of time. At the same time, Sue, I saw you with your hand up. You haven't had a chance yet. Is it feasible?
It's not very important, it's very quick, but I think often in that space, particularly when you're looking at external facing people, the titles have to be very much more geared to the external than to the internal, and then that makes it slight difficulty when they're facing back.
It's a very good point. There's all sorts of stuff to do with language and nomenclature and people's perceptions. I mean, you know, the perceptions are so, you know, changing perceptions. I mean, you may be able to do it with your own team and your own colleagues, but sort of, I mean, things have moved on, even in 10 years, but, you know, it's an ongoing process, isn't it? And you know, you will carry it all forward, because, you know, I won't be around, so. Well, you know, I won't be doing the third space research anyway. So, I mean, you know, it's great for me, it's very gratifying to know that it's sort of something I've done has sort of struck a chord with people in a practical way.
And this time in your own university.
Yeah, I'm a Warwick graduate.
Yeah.
It's the best university.
Okay. Can I just say again, Celia, thank you so very much. I hope that you feel as inspired by understanding this field as I was when I heard it first time. That was in a. I think things have changed.
Yeah, they have.
Quite considerably.
Yeah.
But there's still something there that really is.
Well, I think institutions need to catch up a bit. I mean, I think that, you know, if your enlightened vice chancellors are trying, and certainly some individuals are trying to catch up in the recognition stakes, but it takes time. Yes.
And I think on that one we're on a roll. So we've done one step over the last 2 years.
Yeah, no, it's very impressive. Of course, Warwick leading the way.